I cannot for the life of me understand what the strategy is in general outside the chamber, and what is the strategy at Prime Minister's questions?
Nobody from Kemi Badenoch's team has reached out to me at all since she became leader. And when I get in touch with them, they don't reply.
It's weird.
It's just weird.
The other thing that could happen is that you get a pact, as was talked about yesterday, between the Tories and Reform.
If there was a pact, that is one of those historic moments in British history. That is the end of the Tory party.
Hello, I'm Tom Bradby. Welcome to Talking Politics. Robert and Anushka and I are with me today to dig into the issues dominating the political agenda. Top of the list this week was the Chancellor potentially having lost her headroom on spending due to higher borrowing costs and the likelihood of more tax rises. Joined by Robert and Anushka. Where should we start? Interesting week on the markets. Again, where do we think it leaves the Chancellor?
I mean, obviously, the news on inflation is slightly better news for her today. Not only is the headline rate down a fraction, but actually when it comes to core inflation, that's inflation stripping out goods and energy, and when it comes to services inflation, that is inflation in the very important service part of the economy, actually inflation is down significantly more, I think, than most economists were expecting. And those are those two measures, service inflation, core inflation, are what the Bank of England looks at. I mean, for me, just one aspect of this, which I think is really quite important, is that I think it shows again that the Bank of England is behind the curve. The economy is flatlining, there's no growth. It was obvious that inflationary pressures were diminishing. I think they made a mistake in not cutting interest rates the last time they met. We're now going to have to wait till February for their next decision. And I just think it's yet another example of the, Bank of England just being way too cautious when it comes to the measures they need to take to get us growing again. Unfortunately for the Chancellor, interest rates have been moving against her, borrowing costs of the government going up really quite significantly over the last few weeks, and in particular, the last 10 days or so. Some of that is imported from America. America sets the world's interest rates, and markets think that what Donald Trump will be announcing when he becomes president next week will be inflationary. So some of the rise in interest rates is not her fault. Some of it is her fault. Investors, particularly post her enormously ambitious budget, have become much more pessimistic about the growth rate, more pessimistic about tax revenues, and that's one of the reasons why interest rates have gone up in terms of the interest rate paid by the government, slightly more here than in other competitor countries, and my own analysis is she has no headroom. The interesting question, therefore, is whether or not she will take evasive action. Talking to people in government, they do expect her to take evasive action. We're going to hear from the OBR on March the 26th. At that point, it will confirm whether or not she has run out of money. If she's run out of money, senior members of the government tell me that she will announce an acceleration of, for example, a squeeze on welfare spending. The last government began to take steps to reduce that it pays out an incapacity benefit and disability benefit to people who've signed themselves off work semi-permanently. My sources tell me that the government will accelerate that if it's run out of money in an attempt to reassure investors. But that will be very, very controversial, particularly with the Labour left.
I mean, it's a really difficult week for her on all sorts of levels. I mean, Labour MPs are not behind her in the way that she would want them to be behind her. Keir Starmer obviously did finally, Downing Street, confirm that she was going to be in place until the end of the Parliament, but he very noticeably didn't say that in the press conference that Robert was at earlier this week. And when I'm speaking to Labour MPs, I'm quite surprised, quite loyal Labour MPs, who have got to where they are because of this leadership, basically saying she's finished. Now, what they don't mean is she's finished at the moment, but she has lost a lot of confidence in her own party, which makes things difficult for her. But look, things can change quite quickly in terms of the economy. You talk about...
markets, they can change change quite quickly. I mean, certainly interest rates, if it turned out that Trump wasn't going to be so inflationary, interest rates would fall all over the world.
Yeah, and if the rates come down in February and if inflation continues to be a bit less sticky than we expected it to be, then we could be in quite a different situation. The difficulty for Downing Street and for the Treasury is they really hope that all the bad news would be out of the way in year one and that from now on they could be offering something more positive. But with the headroom looking like it has gone, we don't know for sure where it will be, obviously, by the time of the next budget or whether they'll need to take action before a next autumn budget. But that obviously means more difficulties at a time where if you look at the polls, I mean, Labour's still ahead in most of the polls, but Reform now ahead of the Tories in some polls, and basically all three of them neck and neck. It's not where they would want to be this soon after winning a massive majority.
We have all been around in politics long enough to hear backbench MPs moaning about senior ministers. Is there a kind of logical texture to those complaints when you were listening to them? I mean, what is it based around that she didn't go far enough in her budget or she cut too much? Surely if she hadn't been as tight as she was in terms of kind of increasing taxes and all the rest of it and being tight on public spending, then she'd be in potentially worse state with the markets. But that surely going further wouldn't have endeared her to backbench Tory MPs. So what is it they want?
Well, I'm talking about backbench Labour MPs,
rather than
Tories. But it feels to me like it all it begins for an MP when they hit winter fuel payments straight away because their postbags completely fill up with people complaining about it. And suddenly that is a difficulty for them. There was a moment then when they thought the government would sort of go a bit softer on it. And actually Rachel Reeves came out quite hard on it. And there was murmurs at the time. And so what I think is we've had a slow build since then of frustrations for MPs in rural areas, really frustrated by the farming changes, the inheritance tax changes in the budget. And then when this hits, it sort of then pulls back some of the kind of faith that they may have had. And also, it's worth saying that, some MPs, some cabinet ministers, Wes Streeting, for example, seems to be very active when it comes to making sure that backbench MPs love him at the moment. And perhaps some others are not quite as active on that. But, this is a difficult time for Rachel Reeves. It's an incredibly busy time. Perhaps it's a good thing that she's not spending all her time looking at her own backbenches. But it does get a bit tricky when you don't have their backing. Although my view on the Keir Starmer point about giving her... We all saw when Liz Truss sacked Kwasi Kwarteng, that the thing I think Kwasi Kwarteng said at the time was, if I go, you've got to go. You can't really sack a chancellor without it having massive repercussions for you at the head of government.
Absolutely. Robert, hearing what you said earlier, most people listening or watching this will probably conclude that you think that she has lost her headroom, as you said, and that therefore she is going to have to, the OBR is going to effectively conclude what you suggested it was going to conclude, and therefore it's almost inevitable that the tightening that you were talking about is happening.
If the structure of interest rates...
Am I summarising you correctly?
Yeah, I said as of this moment, there is no headroom, right? Yeah. But, markets are volatile. If the structure of interest rates across the Western world were to come down, then, it's magic. There'd be headroom again, right? So, it's always dangerous to, predict some really enormous change in government policy on the basis of market movements which can change. And let's be absolutely clear, the market likes the inflation figures today, and the market is today placing bets that the Bank of England will now cut more this year than it thought only a few days ago. So it is very volatile. But I suppose the significant point for me is that Rachel Reeves is continuing to do the Margaret Thatcher, I am tough, I'm never for turning act. She said only yesterday that these fiscal rules, which she manufactured, they're her fiscal rules, they are set in stone. We've had so many fiscal rules over the last 15, 20 years. It's always I always think it's slightly laughable when chancellors say these ones are the ones that are never going to change. But she said yesterday, these are the ones of biblical significance, they're never going to change. And if I'm missing them, then I will take really, really tough action. And there is only one thing she can do in these circumstances, because they have said they don't want to put up taxes significantly. she will have to cut. And the one area that they're focusing all their attention on, and maybe it is ripe for medium to long-term reform, right? But they're saying welfare. If they try, I do think it will be a political disaster for them. If they try and rush through radical change to disability and incapacity benefits, frankly, it will not only do enormous damage to popularity with their own side. There's also a risk they won't even work as reforms. This area is hugely contentious and controversial.
On that, just on the global inflationary pressures and what the markets, is it really just tariffs that the markets are worried about with Trump,
No, it's more than that. It's partly tariffs, and you'll be going to the States at the weekend for the inauguration, and we're all waiting to hear whether he says anything very much about tariffs in that initial important address. But up to now, he's been pretty consistent. Big tariffs on the entire world and absolutely mega tariffs on China, and these things would be inflationary and bad for growth. But equally, he's talking about unfunded tax cuts, the kind of thing that Truss did, in a short time. Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng did with their mini budget, a short time in power. These are always seen as inflationary. If he does do unfunded tax cuts on the scale that he's been talking about. So, it's a combination, but basically, in terms of what he said, he has announced a whole series of policies that are A, inflationary, and B, would massively increase both the American deficit and American debt. This is all stuff that investors are anxious about, and it's all stuff that leads to higher interest rates. So, in a way, I suppose the point I'm trying to make is, and this is a problem actually for any Western government at the moment, the room for manoeuvre of any Western leader is really limited until we get a sense of what Donald Trump is actually going to do.
I do think it must sometimes be baffling to voters, to all of us, that headroom can just shoot up and shoot down with these massive impacts on what is going to happen over the next few years, which are based on forecasts. And I think it just is baffling sometimes to people.
And it's crazy as well. This is no way to run a government.
As regular listeners will know, we record this podcast on a Wednesday around Prime Minister's questions, so here are some of the key exchanges from the Chamber.
Why should anyone trust a word he says over the businesses who are saying again and again that his budget means fewer jobs, lower growth and higher borrowing costs?
Mr. Speaker, as you know, the global economy is experiencing volatility and higher borrowing costs. That is why it was vital that we took the tough and right decisions in the budget to get our finances back in order.
Yesterday, the Chancellor repeated her promise to have just one budget per year to provide businesses with certainty. So does the Prime Minister stand by the Chancellor's commitment that there will be only one budget this year?
Prime Minister. She'll be pleased to know the Chancellor will be in place for many, many years to come. She'll outstrip them. If we all thought the politics was about cheap points, I could criticise their chancellors, but I don't have enough time to go through all of the chancellors that they had. We have one budget, that's what we're committed to, strong fiscal rules, and we'll stick to them.
The Prime Minister knowingly appointed a convicted fraudster as his Transport Secretary. The anti-corruption minister he had full confidence in only days ago resigned yesterday in disgrace. He is negotiating a secret deal to surrender British territory, and taxpayers in this country will pay for the humiliation. Now it turns out his government may write a cheque to compensate Jerry Adams. This is shameful.
Among that barrage of complete nonsense, there is one point that I need to address, because it's the Legacy Act, and it will be of real interest across the House. That Act was unfit because, well, not least because it gave immunity to hundreds of terrorists and wasn't supported by victims in Northern Ireland, nor, I believe, by any of the political parties in Northern Ireland. The court found it unlawful. We will put in place this is a serious point. We will put in place a better framework. We're working on a draft remedial order and replacement legislation.
Now, when David Cameron was First Leader of the Opposition in 2005, he pursued quite a clear strategy. Not everyone liked the strategy. Some people hated the strategy, but at least you knew what the strategy was. I've just got to admit, Kemi Badenoch is no longer new. She's had time to get her feet under the table and to sort of work out what she wants to do. I cannot, for the life of me, understand what the strategy is in general outside the chamber. And what is the strategy at Prime Minister's questions? Because, I mean, like, there are about 15 different subjects in her. You know, she went from the economy to the Chagos Islands, back to the economy, then on to, you know, Labour sackings of ministers or resignations. It was all over the place. I didn't understand what she was trying to achieve. Did either of you?
I mean, to be fair, she is still quite new. And I would say that leaders of the opposition do tend to warm up on PMQs. You know, Keir Starmer had quite a long time as leader of the opposition. He's now really proficient at PMQs. I think there are ones in the past where we thought he was quite weak as well.
True.
But the thing I agree with you on completely is I think the most effective way to get results at PMQs as the leader of the opposition is to choose your subject, build a narrative around it, and then use your 6 questions to take people on that narrative. And the reason you need to do that, the same reason why we often want to do that in an interview, is they're never going to give you the answer the first time. So you need to keep kind of delving into it. And I think actually where she began sort of was a sensible place to be, which is the economy. I mean, I think the economy is a very difficult subject for the government right now. But what are you actually trying to argue? And that was where I think it fell down. On the one hand, she's against tax rises. On the other hand, her issue is that borrowing has gone up. Arguably, if you want borrowing not to go up more, you might need to consider tax rises. And then, yes, as you say, she sort of swung out to the Chagos Islands. I think if you don't stick to what you're asking, you are not going to get the results that you're hoping for.
But she also didn't seem to ask any clear questions. Surely the logic of today, like if we were all in a room advising her, and there are lots of good reasons why we're not, but if we were, we'd have said, listen, Rachel Reeves delivered what she very clearly implied was a once and for all budget. That was it. You know, the public spending was going to be what it was going to be. Tax rises were going to be what they were going to be. But that was it. Done. Hard work done. You know, the future is brighter. Now, we're looking at the possibility that Rachel Reeves is going to have to get back into the water and do something else. Isn't that wouldn't you say, can you rule out further cuts to public spending, blah, 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 blah? That's the bit I didn't understand.
Yeah, no, so it is odd that she is not more forensic in that kind of way. But there is sort of something else, and I sort of feel this might be a moment where we can sort of slightly draw back the veil on how we work, given that you started by saying it was all very clear what David Cameron was up to when he became leader. Normally, when you get a new leader, might be a new Prime Minister, you've had enough of those recently, or you get a new leader of the opposition, you will get either the leader themselves or the people around them reaching out to people like me and Anushka to say, this is what we're trying to do, this is how we're going to do it. And the other thing that normally happens is, whether it's the leader or people very close to them, people like me and Anushka get in touch with them, and we say, you know, this is what we think's happening, and they get back to you immediately. None of that is happening with Kemi. I mean, it may be happening with you, but nobody from Kemi Badenoch's team has reached out to me at all since she became leader. And when I get in touch with them, they don't reply.
It's weird.
It's just weird. I mean, you'd sort of think, you know, maybe they don't like me, but whether they like me or not, ITV matters to them, right? We have enormous numbers of viewers. And so it's like they sort of think that they can operate without communicating. It's really odd.
But isn't it the 101 of all good government communications that you don't make it about the nature of the organisation that you're dealing with or the personalities of the individual reporters? The point is, surely you want to get your message across and you want it to be consistent across the piece everywhere, and then that's how you begin to get traction.
She's very unlike. I don't think she likes the media. I don't think she wants to do much with the media.
But even if she doesn't like it, she's got people working for her who at least ought to be speaking on her behalf, but they're not even doing that.
Yeah, but I mean, obviously I wasn't defending the point. I was saying, like, she's done, like, the Laura Koonsberg interview on the BBC. She's done an interview, I think, with You magazine the other day. She has not actually, I don't think, done an interview with all broadcasters, known as a pool interview. So I think the difficulty with this is, on the one hand, you do want to raise the bar in a way. You're the leader of the opposition. You don't want to be doing every interview that comes to you. You want to make sure that I think when one of Keir Starmer's old advisors said to me when he was in opposition, they wanted him to be the 8:10 politician in terms of the kind of thing you were doing. At the same time, you do need to, as Robert's saying, communicate what you are thinking and feeling and saying. And, there was a moment last week where she could have spoken to us. I was actually there ready to speak to her. It was the day that the economy really hit a terrible moment. And actually, I think it would have been a good moment for Kemi Badenoch to be talking about what was happening with the economy. She obviously has her reasons for distrusting the press, I guess. But I do think it is something that they're going to need to deal with. But can I just also add my frustration about all politicians on this? We get really frustrating things from the Labour side on this as well, from the Prime Minister down, members of the Cabinet trying to control what you're asking, us having to say, no, we're not going to do those interviews because we're not going to ask those questions. We're getting it from the opposition as well. It is just so frustrating. And I do feel like it has been a drip situation where we have got worse. And while I'm with you, Kemi Badenoch could have made a much better argument today in PMQs. But one of the things that must be frustrating to her is I don't think I've ever heard Keir Starmer actually answer a question.
But obviously, I'm one step removed from both of you. I haven't been in day-to-day contact with politicians for 10 years since I left Westminster. And I hear your frustrations. I completely understand them. I would be equally frustrated. But I suppose I'm looking at it from one step back, where I'm just trying to understand kind of what the strategy is. And it seems to me this Labour government is not in great shape. They've delivered their budget, which was supposed to be, as we've discussed many times, once and done on the economy, on public spending and all the rest of it, on tax rises. It's now looking increasingly unlikely that they're going to be able to hold the line there, which strikes me as disastrous. They've lost two senior ministers in fairly quick succession, including the anti-corruption minister, and on and on and on. This is, they're level pegging in the polls, as we discussed earlier, with Reform and the Tory party, which strikes me as being pretty disastrous. So if I was Kemi Badenoch, I'd be thinking, right, I have got to be everywhere. I've got to be on it. I've got to make it very clear that the opposition, we are still the opposition and we will be the next government, because we've got to keep Reform down. And I keep, PMQs is maybe the one time when I sort of think, okay, let's see, what's the strategy? To put together the strategy for the rest of the week, and I always just come away like completely confused. Like, what are you trying to achieve?
It's worse than that. It's worse than that, Tom. Right? But on all objective analysis, it's been a terrible fortnight for Reform. First of all, Elon Musk says Farage isn't fit to be leader. Then somebody who was recently senior in the party, Ben Habib, who's now on the outside attacking Farage, sustains the attack. There's all sorts of evidence that right at the top of the party, it's not altogether a happy time. And yet, the latest polls show that they've overtaken the Tories. This is disastrous for the Tory party.
Well, except there is also a poll today that puts the Tories ahead of Reform and Labour. So the polls are basically neck and neck at the moment. But
that's still bad for the Tories.
That's really bad for the Tories and really bad for Labour. But also, there has been a steady shift over many, many decades, actually, to third parties rising, the two-party share coming down. And that is arguably no bad thing.
Let's not get too distracted by Reform, because we talked about them a lot. But just given that poll, does Nigel Farage survive fine as the leader? Do you both think? And what do you think is, we've talked so much, haven't we, about the volatility of politics. Do you think there's a bit of a kind of Trump having moved the dial significantly on UK politics, which partly explains the tilt towards Reform as well, or is there something else going on?
There is no Reform without Nigel Farage.
100%.
One of the things that's slightly odd about the Musk attack is you have to see it as him wanting to destroy Reform, because literally there's no Reform without Farage. My own view is, yes, of course he survives, therefore.
I agree with that. Look at the change since Farage came back and took over in Reform compared to where they were before and where they are now. He's obviously a very, very strong communicator. If he can translate that into the kind of organisational change with his chair, Zia Youssef, that they need to make in order to start, putting down kind of organisation around the country, then obviously it could be really, really threatening. The other thing that could happen is that you get a pact, as was talked about yesterday, between the Tories and Reform, and that would be unbelievably damaging to Labour in the same way as Labour and the Lib Dems. No formal pact, but Labour didn't really fight hard in seats where the Lib Dems were going to beat the Tories and vice versa. And look what it did in terms of
Wouldn't
this election.
Wouldn't that be the end of the Tory party in reality, a pact? Don't they have to engage in a gladiatorial to the death contest with reform? Because the moment they make any concessions to reform at all, surely the Tories are finished.
I agree with that. I mean, I don't think there's any. I mean, certainly, if there was a pact, that is one of those historic moments in British history, like the death of the Whig Party.
Right. Yeah.
That is the end of the Tory party.
A lot of it depends on what the type of seats are, which actually I don't have that data here, but it's the sort of thing we need to look at and think about. That the 80-odd or 90-odd seats where Reform is in second place to Labour, what type of seats are there? Who was winning them previously? Obviously, if it was the Tories who were winning them previously, then that would be massively damaging overall. So it's a very difficult position for them to be in right now. And yeah, same way as when Labour was having some of these kind of ideological struggles, the group that came out top was the group who said, we stay together, we keep fighting, we don't do anything that will divide us. That is obviously a big argument in the Conservative Party right now.
If I was at the top of the Tory party right now, I think what I would think is much better that Labour wins again than that we do a deal with Reform and that Labour is pushed out by a kind of Tory Reform coalition. Because the moment Reform start getting significant number of seats, they're up to 80, they're up to 90, they've agreed a pact with the Tories, then you think, that feels like the end of the Tory party to me. But maybe I'm wrong, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe we have to have a more plural politics because that's what voters want, and they can't have a cartel between the Conservatives and Labour from now on.
One other thing I just wanted to talk about before we close is Northern Ireland, because it was raised at Prime Minister's questions today, and there's
by Kemi Badenoch in about the 4,000 different things she raised.
Yeah. But it was also raised later on as well. Obviously, there's this suggestion that's quite a lot of papers have picked up on Gerry Adams being paid potentially compensation. Let's see. Anushka and I, just before we recorded this, we were talking about Say Nothing, which is on Disney Plus, which is the Troubles era drama that Gerry Adams, I think, won't have enjoyed watching. It's fair.
Although
it's fair
every episode ends with a disclaimer that Gerry Adams denies ever
deny being part of the IRA. It's. I would urge people to watch it. It's good, and I think it captures the early years of the Troubles, but also all the way through. It's about the Price sisters, and anyway, go watch it. There was also a best-selling book on the same subject. What do you think of this? It's a very complicated issue. I'm a little unclear about where it's all going. Obviously, the Tories passed legislation that was designed principally to end prosecutions against former soldiers. It seemed to me and to most people that was the aim of it. Labour has said it's going to repeal it. I have to say, I think a lot of people find it pretty confusing as to where we are and where we aren't.
So there was a significant moment in PMQs in response to Kemi Badenoch saying it's a disgrace that you're going to pay compensation to Gerry Adams for his internment, which was later ruled by the Supreme Court to be unlawful, which is that Keir Starmer said, we will look at ways to prevent these sorts of claimants claiming damages. In other words, he specifically told the House of Commons that he doesn't want to pay Gerry Adams a penny in compensation. That is significant, right? If he's saying that to the House of Commons, that is significant in and of itself. He's also a lawyer, and therefore I'm assuming he knows how to draft the new legislation, which they are promising, in a way that will somehow prevent Adams making a claim. I don't quite, because as I understand it, if you then listen to lawyers about this, human rights legislation will make it very, very difficult for them to restrict a claim from Adams. But he says he wants to do that, and he's going to try and do that.
Surely again, I'm not a lawyer, none of us are lawyers, but internment was illegal. You can't round people up because you think they might be a member of the IRA. That isn't it's obviously been ruled to be illegal. And trying to separate out some people and say you're going to treat those claims differently, I just don't see.
It's not going to be easy, but he could have said nothing.
Yeah,
he very deliberately told the House of Commons that he was going to do his best not to pay that. He's not a risk taker. Right? I mean, if he's one of the most cautious politicians that I've come across, right? I don't believe he would have said that if he doesn't think there is a route to
I disagree
deliver
on that point, but that's for another point. That's
Sorry?
for another. I disagree on the point about him being a risk taker, but that's.
What, you think he is a risk taker?
Yeah, but I think that's too big a chapter.
He doesn't chances. Well, let's talk about next. You think he chances his arm? That's really interesting.
I'll make the argument in my book that I know you've read and loved. Just on this, the Legacy Act was actually disliked by both sides. Yeah, and victims on both sides didn't like it because, of course, it did provide immunity on both sides, and people did not like the idea that people were not going to face justice for these historic crimes. And so that is the reason why they are moving to get rid of it. The question is, do parts of it survive? Like, there was a body that it set up that's going to now deal with legacy cases. It sounds like that's going to survive through this. But of course, this big issue, which is, does someone like Gerry Adams have the right to claim for compensation is what I would call an ethical quagmire. I mean, like, you know, we talked about the thing we're watching, which I won't go into detail on it. You watch Say Nothing and you don't think he should be able to claim compensation. At the same time, he denies all those allegations, and internment, as you say, was something, you know, that has been shown to be completely wrong.
I'll tell you my final thought on this, and it's like, you know, who knows really, and it's a very sensitive subject, and one might argue not really our position to say. But my wife and I went to Belfast last summer, and we hadn't been for a while. And obviously I spent many years of my early career in Belfast when the Troubles are still going on, reported on many of the kind of final big atrocities of the Troubles. We lived there for a long time. We loved living there. We've always loved Belfast. I found it kind of interesting. You go back, there's no Troubles Museum, for example. This enormous event in British public life, you have to kind of go looking for it. You can go to the Titanic Museum, which is a huge, incredibly impressive museum. You can't go to the Troubles Museum. And when I talk to some, like Eamon Malley, who's one of Northern Ireland's longest standing journalists, is a friend of mine, we had a long chat about it. But like the impression I got is that it's not a closed subject yet. They're not ready for a museum and all the rest of it. And I feel like this is something the government might have to address at some point. Like, how do you? Surely we are at the point where you've got the victims, the families of the victims of the Birmingham pub bombings, still trying to seek justice, still trying to find out who was really responsible, what happened, and that's the same for many other atrocities. Is it time for Keir Starmer, as you say, a lawyer, to try and find a way to, I don't know whether it's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission like they had in South Africa, but why is that not on the agenda? Is it just too difficult? Any final thoughts from either of you on it?
So it is. So I was in Belfast a few weeks ago, and actually one of the most, I was just on the positive side, my goodness, it's a lively and
great city.
It's a wonderful city,
I'd urge
right?
anyone to go.
I mean, it's the vibe. It's some of the new developments are fantastic. It's a great city.
Yeah.
I mean, I would like to believe that this is a moment where a charismatic leader, maybe from within those communities or from outside, like the current Prime Minister, could somehow. He cares passionately about Northern Ireland, did a lot of work there. So, it would be wonderful if some kind of truth and reconciliation thing could happen. And certainly among young people, the divisions are definitely more sharply delineated among an older generation, don't you think?
Yeah, but I do think also the Legacy Act, I mean, speaking to, I think it was Brandon Lewis at the time, who was the Northern Ireland Secretary, they felt that they were trying to make an attempt that would cross communities and that would allow people to have some closure, and obviously it didn't.
That's all for this week. Thanks very much for joining us, whether you were watching or listening. Remember, you can view new episodes on ITVX every Wednesday, and if you're enjoying it, please do hit subscribe on your favourite podcast platform to ensure you won't miss out on an episode.